Yara Flor, aka Brazilian Wonder Woman. It's hot up here, so it looks like I'm sweating for Brazilian Wonder Woman. She burst onto the scene in 2021 and received some positive feedback, and definitely some attention. Some negative feedback too. Just lots of talk. She gained the most notoriety during the Future State event. While outlets in DC itself for a brief time tried to push her as the next big thing, fans ranged from receptive and various reactions, people questioning the concept of yet another Wonder Girl when there were already others in play. But she was being talked about, and there was potential there. She was deemed to be the breakout character of Future State. She had a CW show before her story even dropped, and then it was cancelled. She was even being slated to be the next Wonder Woman, and then all of a sudden, she tapered off. So what happened to Yara Flor, and why didn't she secure a foothold like it at first seemed she was going to? And that's not to say that in the future that mightn't happen, but as of right now, time of recording, July 2023, the Yara Flor struggle is real. And there has even been a new Wonder Woman supporting character introduced. DC is taking another stab at a daughter character for Wonder Woman in the form of Trinity. So it remains to be seen if this is gonna push Yara into a limbo state, or some would say further into a limbo state, alongside the other Wonder Girls. When it comes to Yara, some mistakes were made that hurt a character with a pretty interesting and fresh concept when it came to the Wonder Woman mythos. I'm Sasha, this is Casually Comics, and let's explore what happened to Yara Flor. Firstly, who is Yara Flor? Yara was created by Joelle Jones and debuted at the end of what was meant to be a universe-altering event for DC Comics. Insert your when aren't they universe-altering events jokes here. She was seen in Dark Knight's Death Metal number 7. Death Metal was a 7-issue series. For the main event, we'll leave all of the tie-ins alone, and there were many. It was orchestrated by Scott Snyder and ran from 2020 to early 2021 in January. It served as a wrap-up to the Dark Multiverse storyline, with the multiverse being engulfed by the Dark Multiverse. It was also a sequel to Dark Knight's Metal, which popularized the concept of the Dark Multiverse and also some characters from within, although some would argue that they then overstayed their welcome. Batman Who Laughs. It is Death Metal that births the Omniverse. The idea that all things everywhere are canon, you can kind of pick and choose what you care about. It was an idea that had potential in theory, but in implementation has struggled. Wonder Woman was a central figure of this event, and it concluded with her sacrifice to safeguard this new status quo. So at the start of the post-Death Metal period, there was no Diana Prince Wonder Woman, so there was a void to be filled there. At the end of issue 7 of Death Metal, Yara is briefly seen fighting a Hydra as the Omniverse is explained. So it's a very brief snippet. It's in Future State where you really get to see more of her. There was a lot of talk about her. There was clamor around her design, questions about the concept. How are they going to introduce this mix of Brazilian folklore? I know it's more multifaceted than that, but that's kind of the catch-all term for what they were kind of working with how they presented her, because it was a bit more of a generalized view that they took alongside with how they paraphrased the Grecian folklore. So it's backed up with research, but they will make some changes for entertainment, and there was debate as to how accurate some of it was. But in terms of Yara, there's also the question of just who was she? But behind all of this were things that were set to complicate Yara from the start. Future State had some behind-the-scenes drama and rumors swirling around it. It was dropped in January and February of 2021, so right on the heels of Death Metal. No time to breathe or experience the Omniverse in full, going right into Future State. Now the rumors were that Future State was a leftover event from a main plan called 5G, which had been meant to be a new way forward for the DC universe, with new heroes replacing the classic and the concept of something called a linear verse, and just a bunch of things that don't sound like they would have gone too well. But this left Future State in an interesting space while it was dropping. People were wondering, was it the actual future for DC Comics, or were these just a bunch of alternate universe and Elseworld stories? And if that was the case, but why though? Despite this, Yara's stories, at least her solo ones headed by her creator Joelle Jones, were decently received. They were Future State Wonder Woman, showcasing a world where she had taken on the mantle. While in that timeline Diana wasn't recently deceased, it was kind of up in the air as to what was going on with that. It would have felt like that to fans because they were just coming off of Death Metal where she was gone. So it was a bit of a timing issue that led it to feel that Yara was just coming in and taking over, which some were okay with and others not. Now Yara's story showcased a blend of mythologies and a slightly rough around the edges but overall fun character who was enjoying what she did. She was a bit brash, she had some flaws that the story acknowledged as such, and she seemed interesting and like she had potential. Plus many were fans of the art. Her story also opened up questions. There was still the question of what was her backstory, who was she, how did she get a Pegasus, how did she fit into the overall Wonder Woman history? Now not everyone was a fan. Some felt the implementation of the cultural elements were sloppy, others didn't appreciate this new character just swooping in, cutting in front of more established characters. But at this point there was an overall interest, there was chatter around her, and yet the downfall also began here. DC was pushing this character hard out the gate, and that can always lead to a little bit of some pushback. There's just a lot going on. There was a CW series announced for her that was said to have been being worked on since November of 2020, which was even before she debuted. It was certainly before there had been a full story with her. However, in February of 2021, so the second month of Future State, it was announced that this series was cancelled. So the time time frame for the public eye was very much that Yara burst onto the scene, was given a series, and then it was cancelled. And that doesn't look great, regardless of the fact that it didn't really have anything to do with Yara as a character. Much more to do with behind the scenes machinations. It was an odd choice to try to come out the gate so hot and heavy with a series and everything. Too much. Slow down. Meanwhile, in Future State, Yara was being written differently across different stories because she was appearing in multiple different Future State stories, which were also taking place at different points in time. And since she had a brash element to her character, depending upon who was writing her, she could come across as abrasive and unlikable. Another important point to note was that her first stories being in Future State meant that she had debuted potentially and later confirmedly outside the main universe, as Future State was becoming more and more of a potential future and less the definitive one, although some series stuck with the storyline a bit longer than others, probably ones that had more of it built in already. So then there was already a question of, well, if Yara's not going to be Wonder Woman, is she? What do you do with her? She was kind of left hanging a little bit. But for a while, it was still full speed ahead. For Yara, her introduction into the main universe canon would come in Infinite Frontier, which was an event that followed up Future State. Just events everywhere. She would have her first little story in Infinite Frontier 0. This would seem to feature her at the start of her journey to becoming Wonder Girl, as she traveled to Brazil for the first time since childhood, returning at 21. So her Americanization, which some had complained about, would be explained. This worked twofold. Some people still didn't like it, but others felt that their concerns about the character were being noted or addressed, or that the character was evolving and changing. Now, this story in Infinite Frontier would lead into her own solo series, Wondergirl. That's right, her own series right off the bat. Headed by Joelle Jones, this series would start in July of 2021. It would pick up from where Infinite Frontier 0 left off, Yara in Brazil. And for those who have questions about Yara's origins, this is the series for you. It's answered here. You get all of her backstory, learn about her parentage, her history with the Amazons, how it fits in with the rest of the Wonder Woman universe. All of that, it's here. The entire series worked through who Yara was. She was embroiled with Greek gods, had a very questionable romance with Eros. There is an attempt to centralize her as a character who was important to all of the Amazons' history. Her mom was revealed to have left the Amazons to explore man's world. Then she fell for who she believed to be a Brazilian warrior, but who was actually a god. So Yara was a demigod. And then her mother was killed by the gods, and it turned out it was Eros. So there was a lot of blame to go around. A lot of pathos for Yara to mind. A lot of people for her to have beef with. So once she learned about her history, she had the potential to tear Themyscira apart, or just change things. At least that was how it was presented. Now, the series wasn't perfect. Not everything was smoothly implemented. Some things were confusing or over the top. Parts were rushed. The mythology in areas was at times questionable, but it was doing its darn to set Yara apart as a character. And for the most part, it worked. On the Yara front, it worked. The only problem, not many people followed this series. It also had some delays. It ultimately only lasted for 7 issues and 1 annual. Despite the initial push, DC wasn't really able to drive the average customer to check out Yara. By the time Wonder Girl series was going, there was already talk of Diana returning. Plus, in the interim, DC had also decided to spotlight Nubia, which they had also begun doing in Future State, leading up to her role as Queen of the Amazons. This further split attention from Yara. There is a question, who do you follow? Nubia, Yara, the Wonder Woman series itself with Diana? Ideally, DC would like you to follow them all, but realistically, most people aren't. On top of that, the universe was in flux. The Omniverse caused some trouble when it first debuted, and it still does. You need to be very skillful to work within it well. Yara still felt a bit like a separate character who one had to seek out. One who potentially you would only be interested in if you're interested in Yara, and yet she was being positioned as a key player in a Wonder Woman event. A series that would spotlight the return of Diana, and have Yara potentially blow up her world metaphorically. This event was Trial of the Amazons, the first Wonder Woman event since 1992, released in 2022, but announced in October of 2021. So if you paid attention to comic announcements, you already knew that Diana was coming back that far back. Comic book solicitations and announcements. Spoiler city. So Trial of the Amazons. The only thing is it didn't really move the needle, despite all of the it's the first Wonder Woman event in, it didn't generate that much buzz. And it also pivoted internally very quickly from can Diana unite the 3 disparate Amazonian tribes despite their histories and grievances, to a murder mystery of who killed Hippolyta. That and any tension between Yara and the other Amazons was very quickly worked out. She even developed a rapport with Hippolyta, and she died very early in that series. So her conflict kind of vanished, and that was one of the more interesting aspects of how she fit into the Wonder Woman lore. There were so many different ways that she could have been played, and instead it went very quickly to everything's alright. There was a bit of a disconnect as to what to do with Yara now that Wonder Woman firmly was back in her role. What was her purpose? Was she just another character to be mentored by the Amazon like the other Wonder Girls? Especially as mentioned, most of the tension was removed from her very quickly. She wouldn't have had to be an antagonist, but she could have had a different relationship with Wonder Woman and the Amazons than the others. What about her demigod status? What about hearing more stories of the Escacita Amazons? Hers and Eros' very questionable relationship and their feelings for each other. That romance just needed to not have any Cupid's bows, because they were both pricked by the Cupid's arrows. Just One day we should talk about that. What a hot mess. The point is, there was a lot of drama to mine that was kind of skipped over in favor of just having Yara slot in with everybody else. The one conclusion for her in the Trial of the Amazons was Diana officially christening her as Wonder Girl and saying she was worthy of the role. And then Yara went off on a rant about Wonder Girl being a problematic name because she was in her 20s, but ultimately accepted the role. But the name was up in the air, but they never settled on anything else. And then in later stories, sometimes she calls herself it and sometimes she objects to it. And as ever, the universe hurtled on from that point to Dark Crisis and then Lazarus Planet. She did more in Lazarus Planet, but she did feature in Dark Crisis. And at that point, because the Omniverse was in play, main series were ongoing as all this was going on. And so she had entered that point where she would pop into stories as was necessary as a bit of a side character, just a bit of a cameo. Oh, there's Yara. She popped up during the Milk Saga like that for Wonder Woman, fought Eros for a bit, popped up in Nubia, Queen of the Amazons. In Dark Crisis, she was recruited by John Kent to his Justice League, this while the main Justice League was dead. Even though everyone knew they weren't, and even in universe you had characters like Dick telling John it wasn't a big deal, they've been dead before. It really pulled a lot of the gravitas out of it. For everyone, it was Tuesday. But there were some echoes of Future State there, with her kind of joining this proto-league that John was making. She helped in the final battle, helped clean up the hall, but from there we went straight into Lazarus Planet, which had even started at the end of Dark Crisis. That event consisted of 2 main books, Alpha and Omega, and then a bunch of tie-ins. Most of the Lazarus Planet tie-ins dealt with the Lazarus Reign or Resin and people getting new powers, new status quos, but then there was Lazarus Planet Revenge of the Gods, and that's the one that Yara was in. It also tied in the best to the ongoing Wonder Woman book compared to the other titles. In that story, the gods suddenly turned on mortals to get them to start worshipping them again. So the characters who were tied to gods, like Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel, aka Shazam, had to do something. Epic battles ensued. It was 4 issues. It was the longest of the tie-ins, and also the one that felt like had the least to do with Lazarus Planet, arguably. Yara is there, being asked for advice, part of the battle, being flirted with by underage Billy Batson, stopped. But on the whole, it felt as though she were a background character, and the big push around her felt as though it were at an end. In Wonder Woman 800 in July of 2023, in the story Whatever Happened to the Warrior of Truth Part 2, the first person who Diana is seen traveling to in her mind is Yara. Yara is seen tracking deep in the jungle, and it's beautifully rendered. It reiterates that Yara is Wonder Girl, that she's still up for a battle, but also in the process of becoming Wonder Girl, she killed the original version of herself, the one who didn't know about her history and all of those things. It's actually quite deep, but they rush past it. It's not something that her own series really dealt with, and it sounds like something that could have been very interesting. There is always a bit of a struggle for Yara with her heritage, where she came from, fitting in, but it never really got to be explored. And it's not here either. Yara has no problem. She just affirms what Diana needs to hear. A normal life, the one you gave up the moment I put the tiara on your head. I should have warned you, given you a choice. Yara did have a choice, but alright. Stop. I'm strong enough and I don't have any regrets. Guess I never thought to mourn the life I lost in the process. And that's where Yara stands, time of recording. Wonder Girl, appearing sometimes when people want to draw in a Wonder Woman support, but kind of displaced, off to the side. While there is still potential for her as a character, she didn't break out quite the way people thought she would. So what happened? In many ways, Yara was mishandled from the start, coupled with debuting at a very awkward time in DC Comics history, which is part of what led to how they pushed her. Since her inception, Yara has been tossed from event to event, universe reboot to universe reboot. Her own story and the interesting conflicts and different dynamics it gave her with Wonder Woman and the other Wonder Girls were very swiftly dealt with. And oftentimes things happen with her in series that people didn't know about or weren't reading. Some people didn't even know that Yara had been actively used for years since Future State. All of her plot points felt like they were on speed run. Everything we detailed happened between 2021 and 2023. They burned through potential years of plot lines. There were years worth of plot lines in some of those individual things in 2 years. Yara had storylines that could have gone on before she was brought into the fold and became friends with Wonder Woman. That is a nice outcome, but it didn't need to happen so quickly. As a result, Yara is now left in the position of what's her next story. It almost felt as though there was a bit of a fear of leaving her at odds with other characters. Like if Wonder Woman didn't instantly affirm her, or if she didn't get along with everybody right away, that she wouldn't be liked or accepted. But there were ways to have her a bit on the outside, but not be unlikable or abrasive, just have her be coming from a different perspective. There are a couple of ways that could have been handled. Of course, with hindsight, let's go and take a look at some of them. Yara Flor would have fared very well if she had started off not in her own series right out the gate, but as a backup in Wonder Woman series. That way you could have Diana or whoever was Wonder Woman at the front, and then Yara's story in the back. And you could learn more and more about her, see the contrast between her and the other characters in the main story, and then eventually have them sort of work their way together. There could have been a lot of anticipation built, lots of questions about how would she get along with people, even playing with the idea of would she or wouldn't she? Because not all characters need to get along or be best friends. In fact, it's a bit boring if they are. You need a range of relationships relationships to keep things fresh. And that doesn't mean friendship or enemies. There can be a range. People who kind of get along, people who really get along, people who think they get along, but one person really doesn't like them. People who great because people have different personalities and not everybody's methods are gonna work with each other. Or if they're going to, sometimes it has to take time for them to warm up to each other. And some people don't get along on a personal level but work well together, or vice versa. There are lots of different ways you can play with it. There are levels. Yara had some interesting base ideas surrounding her, a new mythology to explore. She was the daughter of two cultures, and that manifested in many aspects of her life. From growing up in America, her demigod status, torn between Amazonian tribes, her love interests who were very different. But those ideas, those themes of where does one belong? How does one fit in? Being told where one does or doesn't if one isn't firmly of one place. There were lots of things that could have been played with, and they were being played out in her narratives. It wasn't ham-fisted or bashing one over the head. She had a lot of potential to work through some different stories that could have related to people and still played out in an interesting narrative fashion because it was happening. It wasn't perfect, but the concept was there. I'm excited about it, can't you tell? She had the potential to develop separately to become worthy on her own, but not in the manner that she did. Not by shoving her right out there out of the gate, pushing her when she didn't have the history or the fan base as of yet. If a different method had been employed and they had waited a bit before pushing her into her own series to get her a bit more established, she may have fared a bit better. Although of course that's a guess. We don't live in that timeline, we don't know. There are of course more stories one can tell with Yara, but now one needs to kind of find a space where she fits, or find a way to work her in. You could still do it via the backup method, please. Time for recording. I'm saying that in hopes that now there is a Yara Flor backup. There are different questions to ask. If we're gonna go for a new Trinity at some point, is she still gonna fill that role? Should we have more solo adventures exploring her mythology? Would people go for that? Would it be fun to have her team up with some of the other Wonder Girls? Would it be fun to play off some of the tensions of the different Amazonian tribes? Although some may feel that Yara had her chance. She didn't land, and it's time to move on to different characters. The character certainly lost momentum and isn't being promoted the same way, but she's still interesting. She's unique. She's something new in the Wendy mythos. Personally, I think there's still stuff to do with her, and that she could bring a fresh new direction to the types of stories and some of the internal struggles. Different dynamics, rich internal conflict of her taking on the mantle when there's all this dark history behind it for her and her people. Yara came into DC in a time of shakeups and reboots, and she kind of got lost in the process, and enthusiasm seemed to dim behind her when she didn't take off right away, despite being pushed so hard. Her own TV series that was canceled, her own solo series being the center of events, and just nothing really seemed to get her to land. But initial enthusiasm and a sweet new design isn't the only thing that will lead to a character having lasting popularity. It's all in the implementation and also sticking to it. I think Yara is a fun character with potential to shake things up. Those are just my thoughts, and I want to hear yours. Have you been keeping up with Yara? Are you a fan of the character? Or do you not like her? Do you feel that she came out of the gate abrasive, annoying, you don't want to see more of her, you're glad that she didn't really take off? Do you feel like she just needed to be handled better? What story would you tell with her? Share your thoughts down below, and while you're down there, please do all YouTube things. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell notification so that you never miss a vid. Are there any other characters you've wondered about? Let me know. I want to chat, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye!